Welcome to our deep dive, into Ephesians 4:3-1. And today we're going to go a little bit deeper than, maybe your typical Sunday school lesson. We're really looking for like those unique angles, those illustrations that'll help this passage to really pop.
Yeah, going kind of beyond the obvious, for sure.
Exactly, because we're talking to an audience here that they already know the verse. They've heard it up a bunch of times.
Right.
So how can we like spice it up a little bit?
Yeah, so we actually have some really interesting sermons we're going to look at today. Some that use football analogies, neuroscience, even pecan pie to unpack this verse.
Okay, I'm sold already. Football and the Bible. Tell me more about this.
So this first sermon is from Waymark Church, and they compared bitterness to a holding penalty in football.
Okay.
You know, when a player grabs onto an opponent's jersey and stops them from advancing?
Right.
The pastor said it's the same with bitterness. It holds you back spiritually.
Oh,
Especially, for a congregation full of sports fans, I think that really worked.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That makes it way more concrete than just talking about these abstract spiritual concepts.
So did they just kind of like leave it at the analogy, or did they go a little deeper with it?
Oh, they went a lot deeper. They talked about how the Greek word for grief in that verse, lupio, implies this deep sorrow that impacts your entire being.
Uh-huh.
And they connected that to the idea that holding on to bitterness actually grieves the Holy Spirit.
Whoa, that's powerful. Yeah, so it's not just like don't be bitter. It's like you're actually damaging your relationship with God.
Exactly. And that's a perspective you don't hear every day.
Not really. Okay, so
Huh.
we got football, we got the Holy Spirit. What about this whole neuroscience thing? I'm very intrigued.
Yeah, so City Church Georgetown took a different approach and focused on anger management as a spiritual discipline, which I thought was interesting.
Okay, anger management. How does that tie into Ephesians 4:3-1?
Well, they brought in this concept of neuroplasticity,
Okay.
which is the idea that our brains can actually physically change based on our habits and experiences.
So they were saying if we consistently give in to anger, our brains actually become wired for it.
Oh, wow.
But the good news is that we can retrain our brains to respond differently, more in line with how Christ would respond.
Okay, so it's not just about suppressing anger. It's like transforming how we react on a neurological level.
Exactly.
That is fascinating. I could see how that would be like a very thought-provoking message for people.
Yeah, it takes it beyond just like be nice and shows that it's a real process we can work towards.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so we got football, we got neuroscience. What about this pecan pie thing? I am dying to hear this one. This sounds very interesting.
All right, so this one's from Sebastian Church, and it's a little more lighthearted. They use the analogy of a nut to represent those difficult people that we all encounter in life.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So they said life is like pecan pie. You can't have pecan pie without nuts.
You're gonna run into some nuts.
Exactly. You're always going to have to deal with difficult people. But the point is, don't be the nut.
Okay,
Don't be the difficult one.
I love that. I can just imagine people chuckling in the pews when they hear that one. But it's also, very serious message behind it.
Right. It's about self-awareness, recognizing our own tendencies to be difficult and choosing to respond differently, especially during, family gatherings or holidays when those things tend to come out.
Right, those are prime nut season for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that you can't control other people's behavior, but you can control your reaction. That's powerful stuff. Okay, so we've got some really great creative analogies so far, but what other unique approaches did you find in these sermons?
Well, several of them explored some of the deeper theological themes related to forgiveness.
Oh,
For example, Waymark Church had this beautiful concept of forgiveness as an act of worship.
forgiveness is worship. I actually have never heard that before.
Well, they were saying that when we forgive someone, even when it's undeserved, we're mirroring Christ's sacrifice. And we're offering that forgiveness to God as an act of obedience and love.
So it's not just about letting go for your own benefit. It's about reflecting God's character.
Exactly.
That is a powerful way to frame it.
And then Landmark Church took kind of a different approach, emphasizing forgiveness as a supernatural act, something that we can't really do on our own.
Okay, so it's not just about willpower or positive thinking. It's about relying on God's grace to be able to forgive.
Exactly.
I could see how that would be really encouraging for people who are struggling with deep hurts and, finding it hard to move on.
Right. It acknowledges the difficulty, but also points us to a source of strength.
Absolutely. And this whole idea of needing help to forgive actually popped up in a couple other sermons as well. There's one from Sand Springs Church of Christ that caught my eye. How did they approach it?
So they focused on the idea that Christian forgiveness isn't just about letting go. It's about choosing not to remember the wrongs done to us.
Okay.
Like actively erasing the record, just like First Corinthians talks about love keeping no record of wrongs. It's not enough to just kind of like pretend it didn't happen. You have to make a conscious choice to forget it.
So it's like a more proactive approach to forgiveness, like you're constantly working to build healthy relationships and reflect God's love.
Exactly.
That's a challenging but very inspiring perspective. I like that.
And to illustrate this point, Landmark Church actually brought in a really powerful real-life example. The Amish community's response to the nickel mines school shooting.
Wow, that's a tough one, but also just like an incredible testament to the power of forgiveness.
Right, so even though they went through this unimaginable pain of losing their children, the Amish community chose to forgive the gunman's family.
Wow.
And their faith and their culture played a huge role in that. And I think the pastor used this example to highlight how shared values can really make a difference in how we practice forgiveness.
Yeah, I bet that sermon really left a lasting impact on people. It's one thing to talk about forgiveness in theory, but to see it lived out so powerfully, like, that's something else.
It really shows that forgiveness is more than just words, it's a way of life.
Absolutely. And you know, what's interesting is that Landmark Church didn't just stick with, religious sources for their sermon. They actually pulled a quote from Dr. Fred Luskin, who's like a secular expert on forgiveness.
Oh, wow.
He runs the Stanford Forgiveness Project.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how they kind of wove those two worlds together. So what did Dr. Luskin have to say about forgiveness?
Well, he said that forgiveness is about being the hero, not the victim in your own story. And the pastor tied that back to the Christian message by saying that we find strength and freedom in forgiveness just like God forgives us.
I love that.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we're not defined by the wrongs done to us,
Right.
but by our choice to rise above them.
So it all comes back to choice.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Okay, so we've talked about analogies, we've talked about theological themes, we've got some real-life examples in there. Were there any sermons that stood out for their use of illustration or storytelling?
Oh, for sure. Waymark Church had this great anecdote about Hank Parker, the famous bass fisherman. Okay. So picture this. Hank's at a tournament. He sees this guy who looks kind of rough around the edges, and he immediately judges him.
We've all been there.
But then this guy does something incredibly kind for Hank, and it completely changes his perspective.
Oh, I love it. What a great story. It shows how important it is to not judge a book by its cover, and how kindness can really change hearts.
Exactly. And it was also a really lighthearted way to make a serious point about choosing kindness over judgment.
Right, and letting go of those preconceived notions that we all have.
Exactly.
Yeah, I bet that story stuck with people long after the sermon was over. So did any other sermons use like really memorable illustrations?
Yeah, Landmark Church used this very relatable image of carrying around emotional trash to represent unforgiveness.
Ooh.
You know, all that bitterness and resentment we hold on to. It's like lugging around these bags of garbage everywhere we go.
Ugh, I can feel the weight of that just thinking about it. What a great visual.
Oh, it weighs you down, makes everything feel heavy and dirty. But forgiveness is like taking out the trash.
Suddenly you're lighter, freer, able to move forward without that burden.
Oh, okay. I'm definitely stealing that one. That is such a good image. It really drives home the point of how freeing forgiveness can be.
Yeah, and it actually ties in really well with that earlier point about forgiveness being a spiritual discipline.
Right.
A conscious choice we make to clear out the emotional clutter.
Yes, make space for grace.
Exactly. And it's not always easy,
No.
but it is so worth it.
You know, it seems like these churches really went above and beyond to find these creative and engaging ways to preach on Ephesians 4:3-1. I'm already feeling very inspired
Me too.
to like take some of these ideas and make them my own.
It's amazing how much depth and richness there is in just a single verse.
Right.
When you start looking beyond the surface.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners are going to be blown away by all the insights that we've gleaned from this deep dive.
It's really interesting to me how many of these sermons use humor. You know, talking about forgiveness. Like, it's not always something you think of as a haha funny topic, but it can be really effective. Yeah, I agree. Like that pecan pie analogy, I was chuckling to myself when I read that one. But it also like makes a really good point. It's not just a cheap laugh. It's making people think.
Right. It's disarming people a little bit and making them more receptive to the message.
Yeah, because forgiveness can be a tough pill to swallow sometimes.
Exactly.
So if you can kind of like laugh together,
Yeah.
it creates that sense of connection. Like we're all in this together.
Right. And it makes people feel more open.
Totally. And especially, I think, in today's world where everybody's just like bombarded with negativity and bad news, giving them something to smile about, even while you're talking about something difficult, I think that can be really powerful.
Yeah, it offers some hope.
Yeah, it's like sneaking in those vegetables with a delicious sauce.
Exactly.
You get all the nutrients without even realizing it. But it wasn't just the humor that made these sermons stand out. We also saw some really great examples of storytelling.
Yes, storytelling. I love that. I think that was one of the things that stood out to me the most. Because stories, they connect with us on such an emotional level.
Right, they draw you in.
And when you're dealing with a concept like forgiveness, that can be hard to grasp, you know? Stories make it real,
Yeah.
tangible.
I'm thinking back to that story about Hank Parker and how he misjudged that guy at the fishing tournament. It's such a simple story, but it really drives home the point about the importance of humility and letting go of our prejudices.
Right, and it's something we can all relate to. We've all been in those situations where we've judged someone too quickly.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And stories like that, they remind us that we don't always have the full picture.
Exactly.
Forgiveness is often about giving people the benefit of the doubt.
Absolutely. And then there's the story about the Amish community and their response to the nickel mine shooting. I mean, that one really stayed with me.
Yeah, that one's hard to forget.
Just the sheer depth of their forgiveness in the face of such unimaginable tragedy.
It's really beyond comprehension. To lose your children in such a horrific way and still choose to forgive.
It really makes you think about where they found that strength. It's a powerful testament to their faith, I think.
Absolutely, to tap into that source of strength and grace.
Right. It's beyond human understanding.
It really challenges us to look at our own capacity for forgiveness.
It sets a high bar.
It does.
But I think it's also important to remember that forgiveness is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
We're all works in progress.
Absolutely.
Every step we take towards forgiveness, no matter how small, is a victory.
I love that. And, you know, it's important to remember that forgiveness isn't just about the other person. It's about us, too. You know, when we hold on to bitterness and resentment, it's like we're poisoning ourselves.
Yeah. It's like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Ooh, I like that.
Forgiveness is about releasing ourselves from that burden. And, you know, going through these sermons, what really struck me was the connection between forgiveness and our relationship with God. It's not just about feeling better or improving our relationships with others. It's about aligning ourselves with God.
Absolutely, because forgiveness is at the core of who God is.
Right. It's how he relates to us.
Exactly.
It's amazing when you think about it. We mess up constantly. We fall short every single day. And yet, he continues to forgive us.
And loves us unconditionally.
It's incredible.
It's mind-boggling, really, and yet we're called to do the same.
To forgive as we've been forgiven.
That's the challenge.
Which is a pretty tall order.
It is.
But it's also an incredible privilege, because when we choose to forgive, we're participating in something so much bigger than ourselves.
We're reflecting the image of God.
Right. And who knows how far that ripple might reach. It could be the catalyst for so much healing and reconciliation.
Absolutely.
That's the power of Ephesians 4:31.
It speaks to that deep longing we all have, to be free from our past.
To experience the fullness of God's love.
Yes, and I think as pastors and Bible study leaders, it's our job to find ways to unlock that power for our congregations.
To make this verse come alive for them.
Because when we do that, we're offering them a lifeline, a path to freedom and healing.
It's a mission worth embracing. And I think this deep dive has given us a great starting point.
Definitely.
You know, we've seen how all these different churches are approaching this verse, the analogies they're using, the stories they're telling.
Now it's up to us to take those insights and make them our own. Find ways to connect with our audience and spark their imagination.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, it's not about delivering a perfect sermon or leading a flawless Bible study. It's about helping people encounter God.
And experience His grace.
And that's a journey we get to take together.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to reflect on what we've learned. What really resonated with you? What creative sparks can you take away from this?
And how can we use these insights to help others experience that freedom and healing that comes from choosing forgiveness? It's easy to get caught up in those like big dramatic examples of forgiveness, you know, like the Amish community.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to remember the everyday forgiveness, the little things that we let go of, those can actually be the most challenging.
Oh, absolutely. Like those little annoyances, those offhand comments or like perceived slights. If you don't address those, they can really build up over time.
And we've all been there, right? Like holding on to a grudge over something somebody said, replaying it over and over again in our minds. It's like we're holding on to a bag of rotten potatoes. It might feel satisfying in the moment, but it's only going to make things stink.
I love that visual. It makes you realize how pointless it is to hold on to that stuff.
Right, and because this goes back to that idea of the emotional trash. We think we're justified in our anger,
Yeah.
but all we're doing is weighing ourselves down.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like choosing to live in a landfill when there's a beautiful park just down the road.
Yeah,
But honestly, those small acts of forgiveness, sometimes those are the hardest.
I agree with that.
Forgiving a major betrayal is one thing, but letting go of those daily irritations, that takes constant vigilance.
It does. It's a choice you have to make over and over again.
To choose grace over judgment, patience over frustration.
Exactly like building a muscle.
Yes.
The more you exercise it, the stronger it becomes.
And then eventually it becomes second nature.
Hopefully.
That's the goal.
I think that's the kind of transformation that Ephesians 4:31 is really all about. It's not just behavior, it's our hearts.
Aligning our hearts with God's heart. And that's a message that feels so relevant today.
Yeah.
We live in such a time of division and anger. Forgiveness almost feels like a radical act.
It does. It's countercultural.
Yeah.
But I think it's the only way forward. If we want to break down those walls and create a world where love and grace can thrive.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's so important for us as pastors and Bible study leaders. We have to keep finding creative ways to share this message. Make it relevant. Make it engaging. Help people see that it's not just a nice idea. It's a principle that can change your life.
It's a path to freedom, to healing, to wholeness. It's not about condoning wrong behavior. It's about setting ourselves free from the chains of resentment.
And I think we've done that in this deep dive. We've gone beyond the surface. We've explored different approaches. And I think we've uncovered some real gems that'll inspire our listeners
I hope so.
to preach and teach on Ephesians 4:31 with fresh passion and insight.
It's been such a rewarding conversation.
Me too.
Digging deep into forgiveness.
So to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to take what you've learned today and make it your own. Find those stories, those analogies, those sparks that'll resonate with your congregation.
Help them to see that forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, but of strength.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. We're all in this together.
Let's be ambassadors of forgiveness
Beacons of hope.
in a world that desperately needs it.
Let's make Ephesians 4:31 come alive.
Yes,
Let's make it sing. Let's make it dance. Let's make it shout from the rooftops.
because the world needs to hear this.
Now, more than ever.